Hey everybody, we're going to get started in about 4 minutes.
Becky, are you messaging with Renee right now?
She didn't send me a text or anything. Do you want me to? Oh, what the heck did I do with my
participants?
Oh, here's my phone. What's that now?
She's just not in the participants for me to unmute her.
Okay, let me send her a message.
Oh, she's calling back now.
Okay.
All right, we are 1 minute away. We will get started in 1 minute.
Okay, Renee,
Hello.
you should be good to go. Yep, gotcha.
Oh, thank you. Finally, thank you.
Yep.
1 minute to go.
And Becky, I just changed all of it to say yes or no. And so we'll get a yes or no answer and we'll be good to go.
Okay.
All right, it is half an hour after whatever hour it is in your individual time zone. So good morning or good afternoon or whatever it is across the different time zones that we're involved in. My name is Scott Burlingame, and I'm an April board member, and your facilitator for the call today. Thanks for everybody for joining the workshop, which is Moving On, Thinking to Get in a Place of My Own. I want to mention a few housekeeping items before we get started today. First, when you scroll over the screen, a menu bar pops up. Depending on what device you are on, you can find the menu bar at the top or at the bottom of the screen. There is where you will find closed captioning for today's session. You can view the captioning by selecting CC tab on the menu. Stream text is also available for today's call. You can find that in the conference website connection instructions for this session. For sign language interpreting, you can find the interpreter on the screen. To join in the chat, please use a word bubble on the same menu bar. Once that is selected, that'll allow you to follow along with the chat or add your own comments. For Q&A, please note that the Q&A box is on the menu bar. Please only submit questions there, as they will get lost in the chat. To ask a question or make a comment, you can also select the hand option on the menu bar, and that allows us to know that you have a question. For those of you on the phone today, or using keystrokes, we ask that you press #9 on your keypad to raise your hand. We will then let you know when we unmute you. Remember, if you join into our conversation, please keep all background noise down, as that'll make it possible for us to hear you clearly. So today I have the honor of introducing our two speakers. First, we have Renee Cummings. Renee Cummings founded the Alliance of Disability Advocates in Raleigh, North Carolina, and served for 12 years as the executive director. She supervised the Alliance of Disability Advocates at the SIL in Raleigh. She supervised the development of the SIL's youth programs and the NCYLF. She served on the North Carolina Silk, both as a consumer and as a SIL director. She is a trainer for SEADA Center, providing training on the ADA and other disability rights laws. Rebecca Williams is a lead information specialist for the Southwest ADA Center. She provides information and resources to individuals throughout the southeastern part of the Americas, on the Americans with Disabilities Act and disability rights laws. Rebecca worked for 11 years for 2 centers and has over 40 years of experience in the disability field. She is a member of APRO. So with no further ado, I'll hand it over to Becky, and you guys can take it from there.
Actually, this is Renee, and I'll start and then I'll hand it off to Becky. So hi, everyone. This is Renee Cummins. And just briefly, I wanted to not only introduce myself, but briefly describe myself. I am a petite woman, 5'2". I am mixed white and Cherokee. I have very dark, long hair, very dark eyes, and prominent cheekbones. And I'm going to now pass it along to Becky.
Good day, everyone. This is Rebecca with the Southeast ADA Center. Want to first tell you what is on our slide. And these 2 little emblems will be seen on all future slides. The Southeast ADA Center is funded by, it's a project of the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University. And the emblem for the Burton Blatt Institute is up on the left-hand corner of the slide. And it's 3 geometric type little emblems that are supposed to represent a person. It's almost like a Y that goes down to a point. The upper part is supposed to be hands, and then there's a little round ball that's supposed to be the head, and they are going around in a circle. One's blue, one's olive green, and one's kind of a rusty orange. And then on the upper right-hand side of the screen is the Southeast ADA Center logo, which is the same colors, the burnt orange, a light blue, and olive green with ADA. 1 letter in each of those, excuse me, in Southeast Center. Southeast is above ADA, and then Center underneath. So you will be seeing those on all of our slides. I am a Caucasian woman, 5'4". I have a little bit past shoulder length, light brown hair now, due to not getting a haircut during the pandemic, and I wear glasses. So we can go on to the next slide, please. The next slide talks about our funding. We are funded by NIDLR, which is the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. The Southeast ADA Center, as with all the ADA centers in the national network, work on 5-year grants. NIDLR falls under the ACL, which is the Administration on Community Living. Next slide, please.
This is Renee. On this slide is our rather intimidating looking disclaimer, but the bottom line from this disclaimer is that we want you to know that our presentation today is intended for informal guidance only and is not meant to be a determination of your rights and responsibilities under the law. Next slide.
Okay, so this slide is asking who is protected under the Fair Housing Act. This is Rebecca. There are 3 pictures on this slide. On the far left is a young boy, maybe looks like 7 or 8 years old. He is sitting in a red manual wheelchair and has, I believe it's I'm going to say it's a chocolate lab beside him. The middle picture is 3 young girls. They're all smiling widely at us, and they all look like they may be young people with Down syndrome. Then the picture on the right is a young man. He is holding a white cane. He looks to be maybe 12 or 13 years old. And I believe he is standing in front of the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., and his hands are feeling the raised tactile letters on that memorial. So that's the picture. So now, who is protected under the ADA and the Fair Housing Act? So the definition under the ADA of disability is what we call a 3-prong definition, and the Fair Housing Act closely follows that definition as well. The definition is a person with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. The ADA also protects people who have a history of a physical or mental impairment that substantially limit one or more major life activities when it was present. So that might be, for as an example, a person who had cancer is now cancer-free, but they cannot be discriminated against because of their history of having cancer. And the 3rd prong of disability people are protected are individuals who are regarded as having a disability. Now, these folks do not have a history of a disability, and they do not presently have a disability, but for some reason, somebody might think they have. And an easy example maybe for us to visualize is, let's say somebody has a splotchy red birthmark on their face, and it's not a disability. It doesn't cause any limitations. But let's say they are not hired for a receptionist position because that potential employer looked at them and thought they have a disability. So that's what the regarded as prong means. Next slide. Okay, this is Rebecca still. The title on this slide is the ADA in Housing, and we have four pictures in this slide. One on the far left shows what looks like maybe a clubhouse with a pool table prominent in it. The middle slide shows it probably looks like a multi-story apartment building with a large pool in the front. Then on the right, we actually have 2 pictures. The one on the top is a red arrow pointing to the right with in white letters for rent. And below that is a black and white graphic of roofs of 2 buildings with Section 8 housing listed underneath that. So where does the ADA apply to housing? The ADA would apply in housing only if that housing is funded with federal monies. Generally, the ADA won't come into play. It would be the Fair Housing Act, but there are sometimes ADA would come into play. Where does fair housing apply, though? So fair housing covers pretty much all aspects of housing. Rental offices are covered, lending offices such as, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought there. Let's go back to the ADA, I'm sorry. So let's say the apartment isn't funded with ADA housing, with ADA money, but I mean government money. Your rental office is going to be always covered by the ADA, which means it has to be accessible to you because it is a public accommodation. It's a place of business. It's where individuals can go in and fill out an application and apply to live there. And so since I messed that up, we'll go on to the next slide.
Okay, this is Renee. The next slide is about specifically the Fair Housing Act which can be abbreviated FHA, but I'm going to avoid an acronym and always say the Fair Housing Act and housing. Just like with independent living, under the Fair Housing Act, the bottom line is choice. So a person should always have a choice of where you want to live in the community and how you want to live. So that might be renting, as Becky was pointing out, or it might be home ownership, but that is your choice. So on this slide, we have 3 pictures, and on the far left is a 2-story building that looks like it's probably a freestanding separate residence in a community. In the middle image, the middle picture, we have what looks to be a duplex, and on the far right, we have a 6-story building that could be apartments or it could be condominiums. So it could be apartments for rent or condominiums for home ownership. And the Fair Housing Act applies to both based on your choice. Next slide. So this is Renee again. On this slide, we want to talk about where does the Fair Housing Act apply. The Fair Housing Act applies, as I said, with both rentals and home ownership, but it's also important to know that the Fair Housing Act applies at every point in that entire process of either renting a unit to live in or in the process of home ownership. So the images we have on this slide, again, we have 3 images, and starting with the one on the far left, we have a picture of what could be a person across the counter from a bank officer. So this person may be applying for a mortgage for home ownership. And under fair housing, all of the points in that process of home ownership are covered. So if this bank officer were to make an assumption or use a stereotype about you because you have a disability, that would be a violation of Fair Housing Act. The decisions in that entire process of either renting or home ownership have to be based on objective facts. So in this picture, if this bank officer were to decide that because you have a disability, and we would, in this situation, conclude that somehow you either bring up disability and disclose in a conversation, or you have a visible disability. In my case, if I were sitting across that counter, I have significant low vision, so it would be very obvious that I'm not reading any of the print materials that we may be reviewing, and therefore my disability would be disclosed. However, that bank officer cannot decide that it would be better for me to rent because someone would be taking care of the maintenance of my unit if I were renting, and they think that that would be better for me to be taken care of in that way rather than having to be responsible for the maintenance and upkeep of my home if I actually own a home. Now that is an assumption based on a stereotype about taking care of people with disabilities, and if I qualified for that loan, it has to be based on that objective information, those objective facts as to whether I do or do not qualify for that loan. So in the center picture, we have a picture of a sign outside of a home, and it has sold above the sign below that said for sale. So the same thing applies in the process of having a realtor show you homes that are for sale if you are in the market to buy a home. That realtor cannot, based on assumptions or stereotypes about disabilities, cannot decide that due to your disability, the realtor thinks that you would be far more comfortable in certain neighborhoods or communities and therefore only show you homes that are available in those communities, or that realtor might decide that because of your disability, the other people who are homeowners on the block or in a certain neighborhood might not be comfortable living with you as their neighbor because of your disability. Those are all violations of the Fair Housing Act. And once again, the decisions in that process of home ownership have to be based on objective facts and not assumptions or stereotypes about disability. And in the last picture on the far right on this slide are Scrabble tiles with the letters on the little tile holder spelling out landlord. So as I said, the whole process of renting is also covered by the Fair Housing Act. So in my particular situation, if I were going to rent an apartment, I might ask for all of the documents, including the rental lease, to be sent to me electronically so that I could review them thoroughly before going in and signing any paperwork that commits me to a lease for a rental unit. And that is covered under the Fair Housing Act. All of the points in the process of either renting or home ownership. Next slide.
Hi, this is Rebecca. So now we're going to talk a little bit about just what is fair housing and discrimination. So generally, it is a violation of the Fair Housing Act to discriminate on the basis of race, color, national origin, sex, religion, disability, or because there are children in the family. And the picture on this slide looks to be a one-story single-family home, and there's a white picket fence in the front yard. Next slide, please. So there's several different kinds of discrimination, and so some of it can be intentional, on purpose, where somebody just, a potential landlord just refuses to rent because somebody is in a wheelchair. Disparate impact is an act considered to be discriminatory if it has the effect of discrimination, even if it's not intended that way. And an example of that may be if a management company requires everybody who is applying to rent at their facility to show a driver's license as their form of identification. And if they say we are only going to accept state driver's license, that could tend to be something that screens out people with disabilities because not everybody can drive due to their disability. So that would be a disparate act because on the surface, it may not mean to be discriminatory, however, it could be. And the solution there is that a photo ID is actually what should be required. Other types of discrimination, would be a failure to provide reasonable accommodations, a failure to provide reasonable modifications, and a failure to meet any design and construction accessibility requirements that are needed under the Fair Housing Act. In addition, that's things like refusing to rent, denying that an apartment is available. So if somebody comes in with a obvious disability, and then all of a sudden the management company says, oh no, we're sorry, we meant to take that down, we don't have any units open, that would be a form of discrimination. Advertising to only certain groups of people, charging a different amount of rent for the same type of an apartment. So you cannot be charged more rent for an apartment simply because you have a disability. And a landlord or management company can't say, well, we figure you're going to cause more damage on the walls because you use a scooter. They can't assume that. Yes, if there's damage, you could be charged as any other renter when you leave, but they can't charge more just based on an assumption that they may happen. And another type of discrimination would be to threaten, coerce, or to intimidate somebody because they are exercising their rights under the Fair Housing Act is another type of discrimination. Next slide, please.
Okay, this is Renee again, and on this slide we're going to talk about renting under the Fair Housing Act and what kinds of questions a landlord can ask you as a prospective tenant. So what can a landlord ask? The landlord can ask you, can you pay your rent on time? So, you know, being timely and paying your bills and therefore paying your rent, that's an important issue, and the landlord can ask you about that. The landlord can ask you if you can keep your apartment clean, because there usually is an expectation in any apartment renting or even house renting, whatever you happen to be renting, that you will keep the residence clean. And the landlord can ask you if you use illegal drugs. Those are all permissible questions under the Fair Housing Act. And on this slide, we have one picture, and it is a photo of a group of young people. Some of them are seated and some of them are standing. Some of them have visible disabilities, and some of them may have hidden disabilities or perhaps no disability. That is a group of young people, and we're assuming that there might be people among that group who would be thinking about moving out and finding a place of their own. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to bring you this particular workshop today. Next slide. Now let's think about what kinds of questions are illegal to ask, and your landlord cannot ask you any of these questions. A landlord cannot ask you, what is your disability? A landlord cannot ask you, how did you acquire your disability? Or any questions that involve the nature or the extent of your disability. Either a question about how it's been in the past, what's going on now, what's the expected progression, none of that. Nothing in terms of the specifics of your disability. That is illegal to ask. And also, the landlord cannot ask you if you can care for yourself. In other words, you are entitled to move out and live on your own, even though you may expect to have assistance from family members or friends or a personal assistant in order to provide the care that you may need. It is not a reason to disqualify you from living on your own if you plan to arrange for the personal assistance and care that you may need to get from other people and supports and services. And the landlord cannot ask you about that, and definitely cannot decide that you cannot live in a unit on your own because of the fact that you plan to access personal assistance and care from other people. So on this slide, we have two side-by-side pictures. The one on the left is a person in a wheelchair waiting on a transportation platform, possibly for boarding public transportation. And the picture to the right of that is two people who are signing and communicating with each other. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, we're going to get into the two key areas of your rights under the Fair Housing Act. And on this slide, it says understanding reasonable accommodations. So I'm going to begin by explaining reasonable accommodations. A reasonable accommodation is simply a change in a rule or a policy that the landlord or management or housing complex may have. So these are the rules and policies that you are expected to abide by and live by. but there may be a very good reason that you need to ask for a change in that policy or rule, and that's a reasonable accommodation. Now, what you would request is a change that is needed because you are a person with a disability, and this change is needed so that you can fully use or fully enjoy the dwelling or the common areas in the residence that you are either wanting to rent and move into, or where you already happen to be living, but you have come up against a barrier, which is one of those rules or policies, and you are requesting a change in that rule or policy. And in that request, you are explaining how it is related to your disability. You don't necessarily need to put this in writing, but it's highly recommended that you would address a letter to your landlord, your management, and explain that you are a person with a disability. Don't have to go into details. Like I said before, the landlord can't ask, and you are not required to disclose any details, the nature of your disability, the extent of your disability, or even the name of your disability. If that is not necessary, it is only necessary for you to say you are a person with a disability and this is what you are requesting, this is what you need, and this is the reason why. And the reason why is, once again, what I just said about how it is connected to your disability and the fact that this change will allow you to better use or better enjoy where you are living, your residence where you are living. So you put that in a request, hopefully in a written form so that you have a record of it, and then you submit that to your landlord or your management, and the landlord will decide if what you are asking for as a reasonable accommodation is reasonable or not. And by reasonable, we mean that it will not be an undue burden. It won't be a hardship. It won't be difficult for the landlord to be able to give you what you're requesting, and that it won't cost anything at all, or the cost will be minimal. At any rate, the cost will not be a burden to that landlord. So basically, that's how the process works. You disclose a disability, most often in written form, so you have documentation that's recommended. You explain how what you're requesting, that change in a rule or a policy, how that is related to your disability, and that it will allow you to better use or better enjoy the residence where you are living. And then your landlord will make the decision on whether that is reasonable for them to do or not. And as an example, we might have a person who wants to rent an apartment, and the policy or the rule in that apartment complex is that the rent has to be paid on the first of the month. Rent is due on the first of the month. After the first, the rent is considered late and a late fee is added. But you happen to be a person who has a disability income that is always deposited in your bank account on the third of the month. So as a reasonable accommodation request, you might put in a letter that you are a person with a disability who has an income that is not available until the third of the month, and so therefore you are asking for a reasonable accommodation of being able to pay your rent on the fourth of the month or the fifth of the month, whatever seems to make the most sense for you, so that you can be absolutely certain that your income has been deposited before you turn around and pay that rent. That would be an example of a reasonable accommodation request under the Fair Housing Act. Next slide. So let's just look at a few pictures on these next couple of slides that show us examples of reasonable accommodations. On this slide, we have a large picture on the slide that has a parking lot that shows the section of the parking lot that has 2 accessible parking spaces and a space between them in common that most likely is for van accessible because it is equal size to the 2 parking spaces, accessible parking spaces on either side, to the right or to the left. Now, if you were a resident in, we're going to assume that this parking lot and these parking spaces are serving a housing complex, such as an apartment building. If you were living here and you are a person with a disability that results in very low stamina, low energy level, in other words, you exhaust easily, and you find that when you come back from shopping, it is very difficult for you to get your packages or your groceries from the parking lot and into your apartment. So you would like to ask that the partial space in this picture that is just to the left of the accessible parking space on the left, that space be dedicated to you as a reserved parking space, so that when you return from shopping and you have packages or you have groceries and you need to be able to get all of the things that you've purchased from the parking lot and into your apartment, and these parking spaces are very close to the entrance that goes to your apartment, so you've decided to request that space be dedicated a reserved parking space for you, so that due to your disability, you will be better able to get your packages into your apartment and better use and better enjoy living in this apartment complex. That would be an example of a reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act. Next slide. So let's take a look at just one more example of a reasonable accommodation. On this slide, we have 2 side-by-side pictures. The one on the left is a sign that has a big attention across the top, and below that it has on the left an image of a dog, and then to the right of that it says, "No pets allowed." So in this apartment complex, there are no pets allowed. However, looking at the picture on the right, we have a person in a wheelchair with a dog on a leash, and the dog is currently in the photo on his hind legs using a front paw to activate the call button for the elevator. This is a service animal. A service animal is a reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act, even in a complex or a residence where the policy is no pets allowed. A service animal is not a pet and therefore is a reasonable accommodation and allowed under the Fair Housing Act. So now I'm going to turn it over to Becky on the next slide, and she's going to continue with the second area of rights under the Fair Housing Act.
Hi, yes, this is Rebecca. One thing that I failed to make clear is that individuals, folks who have disabilities who are buying a house or moving or wanting to move into an apartment, you do not need to ever disclose that you do have a disability unless at some point you know you're going to need either an accommodation or modification. So just as in employment, you do not need to disclose disability unless you have a need to. And I do want to also let folks know that a housing provider can deny a request for a modification or an accommodation if the request was not. The host has asked you to start your video. I'm sorry, I don't know what this is. We're not doing a video. Sorry, something popped up. A housing provider can deny a request if it wasn't made for or on behalf of a person with a disability, or if there's no relationship between the request and the disability. So there has to be a disability-related need for either the accommodation or the modification for it to be considered reasonable. And as Renee has said, the reason for the accommodation or the modification is for that the person with a disability can use and enjoy the premise. So reasonable modifications are structural changes to the actual property there, to the existing premises. And those structural changes can occur either in the actual unit where the individual lives or is going to live, or it could be structural changes to exterior dwellings and common place areas and public areas such as clubhouse or the swimming pool. Now, big difference between the accommodations, which again is a change in a policy, practice, or procedure, and the modifications is any cost associated with the change in policy, such as putting up a reserved parking sign for a tenant. That's at the expense of the management or the landlord. When we're looking at modifications to property, the cost for those structural changes is the responsibility of the tenant. So if somebody needed to have grab bars installed in their bathrooms, they should be permitted to do this, but they must pay for it. If someone had a mobility impairment and could not negotiate steps but wanted to access the swimming pool because it's good therapy, they have the right under Fair Housing Act to have a pool lift, a chair lift, installed at the pool at their expense. And when there are changes to property, the landlords can require that any work permits or building inspections or building codes that need to be met are done so. The tenant who is paying for these modifications has a responsibility to ensure that any structural changes do meet any building codes that the municipality requires. And then one last thing about reasonable modifications is that when that tenant leaves, if they decide to move somewhere else, the landlord can require that any structural changes inside the unit be reverted back to the original condition. So they could say, we want you to remove those grab bars. Now, if anything was done to common areas, or say somebody did put a lift in the pool, those changes to exterior areas do not have to be reverted back to the original condition. So you wouldn't have to pay to have that pool lift removed if you moved from that particular place of residency. Next slide. And here just are a couple examples of reasonable modifications. There are 3 pictures. The one on the left does show a couple grab bars in a bathtub area. The middle picture shows a metal ramp that leads from a sidewalk up to an entryway. And then the far right picture shows a young lady on a pool lift going into a pool. Next slide. All right, so anybody ready to move out? That's great, but wait, what would you do if you were hit with this obstacle? And Renee and I are going to read some case scenarios to you or potential issues that may come up. And then we're going to ask you to vote on whether you think it falls under the Fair Housing Act. And if the answer would be yes or no, if you have coverage. And I'm not sure, Sierra, how we decided to do this, if you're actually going to still put the question up or you want me just to start with the first one. But our first scenario is Anthony uses a manual wheelchair. There is not a safe route from his apartment to the rental office. The apartment management has a policy that everyone must bring the rent directly to the office. Anthony asked to be able to mail his rent. Is this allowed under the Fair Housing Act? What do you think? Yes or no? And are we able to do a poll here, or?
Yep, the poll's launched. There's about half of the group has voted thus far.
Oh, okay, because I don't see that.
Great.
All right. So we'll just give another minute or two because I don't, maybe I just don't know what I'm doing here, but I don't see the poll.
Nope, you're fine. There's about 50% of the group, so you can stop it whenever.
Okay, sure. Yes. So what does it look like, Sierra? What you said about half the group voted, and what does this seem? Are they thinking yes or no?
We have 97% yes and 3% no.
Okay, and 97%, you guys got it. This is a type of reasonable accommodation. It is a change in that policy, practice, or procedure that Renee talked about lately. And, you know, it's not going to be an undue burden or fundamental alteration in the way they receive rent. The big deal is to get the rent on time. And if Anthony can get it there via U.S. Postal Service or whatever other way, because he can't safely get to the rental office, this would be considered a reasonable accommodation. And Renee has the next scenario for us.
Okay, so this is Renee, and my scenario is about Rachel. Rachel has a condition called photophobia, which makes her eyes very sensitive to sunlight. She has asked her homeowners association if she can install dark screens over the windows to block out the bright Florida sun. Her homeowners association denied her request. Is this a violation of the Fair Housing Act? Yes or no?
Okay, it's launched now.
All right, and Sierra, you can tell me when you think enough people have weighed in and what the percentage each way is, and then we'll go from there.
Here we got 50% of the group so far.
We have people that are really responsive. That's great.
All right, I'll go ahead and end it now. So we have 75% say yes, 25% say no.
Okay, there was a little bit of confusion on that one. The answer is yes. Most of you were on board with the fact that that is an example of a reasonable accommodation. A lot of homeowners associations, as some of you may know, they require that all units are very uniform, and so a lot of times that includes that you can only have like white shades on your windows behind your curtains. But because this request that Rachel is making is related to her disability, and that she is going to assume the cost of putting up those dark screens, that yes, this would be allowed under fair housing as a reasonable modification. As Becky was saying, the costs would be incurred by Rachel, and if Rachel were to move from that unit, that she would be expected to take the dark screens down, which she may want to do anyway if they might possibly fit elsewhere, but even if they don't, they would have to be taken down, and when she moved, she would be taking those with her. But she should be allowed to do what she is requesting under the Fair Housing Act as a reasonable modification. So now I'll send it back to Becky. Are you there, Becky, with the next one?
Becky, if you want to go ahead and unmute,
Oh, I don't know why I was muted. Okay.
there you go.
Okay, so great. So we're going to talk about Gregory. Gregory, when he applied for the apartment, he knew it was a no-pet apartment. But he decided he wanted to rescue a dog from the local shelter, so he did so. And when the management found out, they said, you can't have dogs. And Gregory said, oh, this is my emotional support animal, because he knew of a friend of his who had an emotional support animal. So the apartment management said, well, we need some documentation to support that you need an emotional support animal. What do you think? Is the apartment management permitted under the Fair Housing Act to ask him for documentation? Yes or no? And I know we need to kind of move along here. We have a couple scenarios to get, so let's just go with how many folks responded now. Sierra?
Okay, we have 75% yes, 25% no.
Great. Okay, thank you, Sierra. Yeah, the answer is yes. When the need for requested accommodation or modification is not evident or apparent, a housing provider may request reliable disability-related information that does three things. It's necessary to verify that the person has a disability as we defined it. Now, it does not have to include the exact diagnosis, but the documentation must support that the person, the tenant, has a disability. It has to describe the needed accommodation or modification, and it has to show the relationship between their disability and what they're requesting. So those 75% of you that said yes, you had it correct. Now we'll move on to Renee for the next one.
Okay, we're still sticking with Gregory and his dog that he found in the shelter. So the management, as Becky said, has asked for some documentation. So Gregory provided his apartment management with a letter that he obtained from an internet source for certifying emotional support animals. Does his management have to accept this documentation? Yes or no? And how are we doing, Sierra?
We got about 50% right now. I can go ahead and stop it.
Okay.
It's 25% yes, 75% no.
Okay. The answer is no. The Housing and Urban Development has noted as recently as January of this year that there are a number of websites out there that are selling certification or registration or some sort of licensing documents for assistance animals to just anyone who goes on the internet and answers a few questions or gives a short interview and then pays a fee. So the Housing and Urban Development has noted that this is becoming available to far more people than are covered under fair housing due to their disability. And under the Fair Housing Act, the reasonable accommodation request, of course, has to be a reliable document. So in this instance, the answer for Gregory would be no, that he needs to have reliable documentation that the animal that he says is an emotional support animal or an assistance animal has some documentation that is reliable and is from a credible source and not something that you or I or anyone could find on the internet. So let's go to Becky for the next one.
Okay, great. Thanks, Renee. Okay, at 20 years old, April is thrilled to finally be moving into her own apartment. Now, her mother has been her direct care provider. However, April plans to hire someone to help her once she moves out. The apartment where she is moving states that only family members can live in the unit. April is renting a 2-bedroom unit and she wants to know if her personal care provider can live with her. Should this be permitted under the Fair Housing Act? What do you think? Yes or no? And how are we looking?
We're right at about 50% now.
Okay, let's go with that then.
We've got 12% say no, 88% say yes.
The 88s have it. Yes, this is a type of reasonable accommodation to a policy. Management would need to show why this would impose an undue financial or administration burden, but it's not going to cost them anything. Or again, it would have to fundamentally alter the operation of that housing community, and there is no fundamental alteration here. So individuals can have, as Renee talked about earlier, personal care attendants who might come 2 hours a day, might come 16 hours a day, or might be a live-in. The amount of time that a person has a personal care provider cannot be restricted under the Fair Housing Act either. Okay, on to you, Renee.
Okay. This one, you can hypothetically think about anyone that you might know. Your rent is $605 a month for your 1-bedroom apartment. Your supplemental security income is $780 a month. You ask your landlord if the landlord will lower your rent to $550 a month, so you will have more money for other bills, groceries, movies, eating out, and so on. Does your landlord have to do this? Yes or no? Does your landlord have to lower your rent according to your level of income and your request?
We're at about 50, almost 60%.
Okay, how does it look?
All right. We are at 3% yes, 97% no.
Great job. Okay, the answer is no. The landlord is not required to lower your rent due to your income. Under the Fair Housing Act, as with all civil rights laws, the bottom line is to provide a level playing field and equality across all tenants. So all tenants who rent the same type of unit are expected to pay the same level or same amount of rent, regardless of whether it is a person with or without a disability. So the answer to this one would be no. I'll pass it back to Becky.
Okay, and just kind of as a little follow-up, because I think I saw something in the chat when I looked at it real briefly. Somebody asked about whether or not a renter with a disability would have to meet the typical salary be 3 months what your rent is, and the answer again is yes. That is equality under the Fair Housing Act. So if a renter without a disability, their income is expected to be 3 months of the monthly rent, then a renter with a disability would have to meet that requirement as well. So now about Raphael. Raphael uses Canadian crutches to help him walk. And he can't carry packages for long distances because he can carry maybe one bag in one hand and then that's it. So he backed into his parking space at his townhouse because it would be, he could unload his truck and his trunk, and it would be closer to his back door. And so his HOA president told him that residents are only allowed to pull into spaces, and if he backs in again, he's going to receive a fine. Should Raphael be allowed to back into his parking space? Yes or no? What do you think? And how are we, Sierra?
We just hit the 60%.
Okay, so we'll stop it there. And what are folks thinking?
We've got 94% yes, 6% no.
Hey, Renee, I think people have been listening to us here and paying attention. So absolutely, yes. This is an example of a reasonable accommodation. However, once Raphael unloads his packages, he could be asked to pull his car into the parking space after he was completed unloading. And now to number 8 with Renee.
Okay, this is about Suzanne. Suzanne lives in an apartment complex. She uses a walker for mobility. There are never any parking spaces near her door, and other residents are always using the accessible parking spaces. Does Suzanne have any rights under the Fair Housing Act? In other words, is there something that she could request under the Fair Housing Act that she could address this situation? Yes or no?
All right, and
And where are we?
we're at 50% now.
Okay.
Oh,
What's it
somebody
look like?
asked Renee, can you ask the question again?
Okay, does Suzanne have any rights in this situation? In other words, is there something that she could do as a request under the Fair Housing Act? Yes or no? The fact that she never has any place to park that's anywhere near her door.
Okay, I'm
And
gonna
she
go ahead.
does use a walker. Go ahead.
Yes is 96% and no, we have 4%. And we just have about 3 minutes until we're done.
Okay, I think I'll answer this one, and then Becky, we probably ought to do the question and answer. But the answer is yes. I talked about the fact that you could request a reserved parking space. Suzanne could do that. And even if the complex has the required number of accessible parking spaces, that may be something that could be requested. But in her case, since she's using a walker, it may be just to have a reserved parking space that would not need an access aisle. It would just simply need the appropriate sign that listed it was reserved for her use only. So I'll go to Becky.
Okay, and I think just because now we're down to 2 minutes, we had 2 more situations. I'm going to read the question as well as the answer, just so we can get through both of these, because these are both a little different, and I think they're important for folks to hear. So Juanita was addicted to opioids when she was in high school. She went through a 6-month rehabilitation program and has been in recovery for 3 years. She's excited about moving out of her parents' house and into an apartment. She's been filling out lots of applications, and one rental office told her they do not permit people who have had drug addictions to live there. Our question would have been, is this legal? The answer is no. People with past drug addictions are protected under the Fair Housing Act. However,
I can do the next one, Becky, if you want me to.
However, if Juanita begins to abuse drugs again, she absolutely can be evicted. So you have to be in recovery and non-using drugs to be protected. Okay, go ahead, Renee.
Okay, Mrs. Roberts called with a complaint to her homeowners association. Meetings are always held in a noisy restaurant. Her husband is hard of hearing and cannot hear what is being said during those meetings. She wants the homeowners association to move the meeting location from the restaurant. Do they have to move the meeting? And the answer is no. The main thing they have to provide is effective communication, but that could be done through a number of options, including seeing if there's a closed off area in the restaurant where the meeting could be held and there would be less noise from the rest of the restaurant, or it could be using a portable PA system, assistive technology like a pocket talker so that everybody is talking into the pocket talker and her husband could be listening through that device. Or there are other assistive technologies out there such as a live translate, which is available to download on an Android for free and on an iPhone with a charge. So there are options, and the answer would be no, that it wouldn't necessarily mean that it has to be moved from that restaurant. Okay, Becky.
So really quick,
we do have.
Sorry, we're
Go
right
ahead.
at the end of time. I was going to go ahead and say, if anybody has a question, if you want to drop it in that Q&A box, we can capture those and send those to the speakers today, and that we can post the answers on the website in this session.
Right, and we do have one last slide that just has contact information and resources. I want to make sure people are aware of some of those. And as Sierra said, we will respond to all questions that we receive. We're sorry we ran out of time and couldn't answer them in person for you right now. It's really tough trying to do a 60-minute presentation. We do appreciate everybody that was here with us, though.
And Sierra, I need to say that my email address on this slide is incorrect, but I will get that to Sierra. And Sierra, if there's a way that you can get that to either attendees or, like Rebecca said, we'll do answers to any questions that came in that we did not get, and I can make sure that it's provided at that time. But just know that the Renee.Cummins should have had a 17 and then @gmail.com. So do not use the, do not use the email that appears on this slide. Sorry about that.
No, it's my fault. Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, we'll get that updated and added to the website as well. So thank you all for joining. When you exit the call today, you'll get an evaluation. We ask that you just fill that out, and we'll see you in a bit.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.